Okay, we are live. You can start.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's presentation and discussion about this wonderful title that was suggested by a friend, Compassion Starts on Your Plate. So today we're going to be exploring different perspectives and different arguments about why one should probably consider being vegetarian or move towards becoming a vegetarian. And this will be hopefully a useful presentation for people to think about this topic. So before we start this presentation and this discussion, we can prepare ourselves for the session and maybe start by relaxing our body, speech, and mind. So we can start by taking some time to adjust our posture, to feel comfortable in a good position, and to relax our speech. We often say that we can simply breathe and follow the breath. And just observe the air coming in and out of our body. And just at the same time, relax our mind. Just be in the present moment. And focusing on the breath can help bring the mind to the present moment. And while we're doing this little meditation, we can also contemplate all the positive effects that can be brought to one's life by spending time to reflecting on topics like this. And hoping that whatever reflection, personal reflection we can generate can be beneficial to ourselves and to people around us. And as we will be seeing today, not only human people, but all beings around us, especially including animals. So we can aspire that this kind of reflection, this kind of time we take for ourselves can help us being positive forces in our environment and bring benefit to countless beings. Okay, thank you. So we will start today's presentation, and does it work? Does it not? Oh, here, okay. And I thought that we could start a bit maybe in a different way as what we normally do. So we just want to start with a story. And actually there are many stories of conversion. And there might be as many stories of conversion as there are people converting to a plant-based diet. Perhaps you have already been through such conversion, or maybe you're contemplating the idea of changing your diet. And the goal of this presentation is to highlight the issue of meat, or the issues of meat consumption. Despite the increasing availability of vegetarian options in restaurants, and a growing openness towards vegetarianism in the general population, it's evident that a significant majority of people still primarily consume meat proteins. While societal perspectives on ethics and human rights continue to evolve, the discussion around animal ethics appears to be progressing perhaps at a slower pace. And I wanted to start with actually presenting or introducing Ed Winters. Ed Winters is a young man. He's also perhaps better known as Earthling Ed. He's a content creator on social media. And he's actually an English animal rights activist in his early 30s. And he became a vegan when he was about 16 years old. And I thought that it could be interesting just to hear the way he tells his own story about how he became a vegan. So this is taken from his book that we see on the screen right now, Vegan Propaganda and Other Lies the Meat Industry Tells You. And this book is in itself a very interesting book for anyone who is curious about adopting a plant-based diet and who want to inform themselves with facts about what's happening in the meat industry. So here is the story that he tells. Everything started to change for me in May 2014 when I was browsing through the news on BBC website and came across a piece about a truck carrying 6,000 chickens that had crashed on the way to a slaughterhouse near Manchester. I clicked on the story and was horrified to read that many of the birds had died immediately on impact. In total, around 1,500. However, what disturbed me more was the fact that thousands of chickens had survived and were left lying on the side of the road, bleeding out with broken bones, combs, beaks, and wings mutilated and suffering. It was the first time I had ever found myself empathizing with animals whom I consumed and thinking about our treatment of them from an ethical point of view. Consequently, I was forced to confront the fact that these animals have the capacity to suffer, something that, although obvious, I had never stopped to consider. It also occurred to me that they therefore had a preference to avoid that feeling of suffering. This led me to empathize not only with the chickens involved in that crash, but also the chickens who were being farmed for me. They too, after all, suffered, except they were suffering because of choices that I made. At that point in my life, I was a self-proclaimed KFC addict, Kentucky Fried Chicken. In fact, I visited my local KFC, which was only a 10-minute walk away, so often that the workers knew my name and my favorite order, a Zinger box meal, towered up. To say that I enjoyed KFC would be an understatement. I absolutely loved it. My bi-weekly trip to KFC not only provided me with a meal, it also formed a huge part of my identity and life at that time. Like most people, I precariously balanced on the tightrope of mocking people who didn't want to hurt animals while simultaneously professing myself an animal lover. Yet in that moment, reading about the crash, I recognized the absurdity of my balancing act and gave myself an ultimatum. I could either bury my head in the sand, ignoring the feelings of guilt and discomfort that causing suffering to animal created within me, or live by my new principles that I was beginning to form and change my lifestyle. I opted for the latter. I had realized something important about myself. My values were not in alignment with my actions, and I wasn't alone. As a society, we're overwhelmingly against animal cruelty. Most of us think that harming animals is reprehensible, but animals are subjected to violence every single day on farms and in slaughterhouses. So why are we selective in our compassion towards animals? And why are we only outraged by some forms of animal cruelty? So personally, I feel like this is a very revealing conversion story that might have been the case for people who are listening to this presentation when at some point maybe they witnessed a situation of animal suffering and then that made them reconsider their situation. So it's very interesting to see that he was a deep animal lover, animal food lover, as I was as well before becoming a vegetarian myself. And through this kind of contemplation, through exposure to animal suffering, it led me personally to progressively move towards a vegetarian diet. So this is, again, the idea of this presentation today. But as also Ed Winter said, society is probably sometimes sending signals, or not just society, but sometimes our friends, our family, our immediate surrounding send signals that make things a little bit difficult for us who might want to adopt such a diet. And there are stereotypes that are present. So we see derogatory terms like soy boy, for example, emerging. And this reflects a societal backlash against plant-based diets. And it targets vegetarian men in particular. This term, soy boy, originates in online communities closely related to alt-right and the manosphere. And it criticizes men who deviate from conventional forms of masculinity. It attempts to associate plant-based eating and environmental consciousness with weakness or perceived lack of ambition, highlighting the intersection of diet, identity, and gender stereotypes. So this is one case, one example, but there are many other reasons or other situations that make the adoption of a vegetarian diet maybe a little bit more complicated. But I think it's interesting to point out that this term has emerged. And by the way, the science has shown that this is only a myth. And it came from the idea that there are isoflavines in soy, for example, and it's a type of phytoestrogen. But it does not lead to, according to science, that does not lead to hormonal imbalance, or it does not lower testosterone levels, or does not lead to physical feminization, which is something that we hear sometimes in the media. And we see that there are trends that tend to go towards even more meat eating. So a study conducted in 2025 suggested that more than 98% of American households purchase meat, and 45% of shoppers are actively trying to prepare more meals containing meat or poultry. Also, that study shows that 77% of shoppers agree that meat and poultry are part of a healthy diet, which is up more than 20% since 2020. So imagine sitting down to eat. And actually this presentation is an invitation to question this situation and question gently without judgment. So maybe sometimes the examples or the arguments that are used will be strong, but it is always done with good intention and without judging the person who listens, because obviously everybody is in a different context, but it's interesting to think about this. And the question of meat eating can be particularly relevant in the context of individuals practicing Buddhism. Actually, one might ask, as a Buddhist practitioner, is it acceptable for me to eat meat? As a quote-unquote serious Buddhist practitioner, should I continue this habit? So by the end of this presentation, you should be able to answer this question for yourself. It is likely as hinted at by the title that the ideal answer should be probably in the negative. However, it is worth noting that that one does not have to be a Buddhist practitioner to choose a vegetarian lifestyle. Ed Winters, for example, whom we introduced before, he's not a Buddhist, and he actually has criticized Buddhism for not emphasizing ahimsa, or nonviolence, and loving kindness towards animals enough. And this criticism was after a trip he made to Japan. So that's an interesting thing in itself. So we don't need to be Buddhist to be vegetarians, but being a Buddhist raises even more the question of the practice of meat eating. So we will revisit this idea a little bit later in the presentation. But maybe before we proceed, I wanted to start with a few important considerations. So this discussion primarily addresses individuals who, with no specific dietary restrictions, and also who have reasonable access to diverse plant-based alternatives. We acknowledge that health needs and geographical limitations may necessitate different diets. And these circumstances are outside the scope of our current focus. So dietary changes are deeply personal. And it's important to always consult a doctor or a nutritionist for tailored advice before regarding your specific health situation. We advocate for education in moderation. Drastic shifts from a heavy meat-eating diet to a fully plant-based one are not recommended without careful planning and professional guidance. So this is not something that we change from one day to the next, from being a heavy meat eater to becoming a strict vegetarian in a short time, because this could have great impacts on one's health. So it's important to be mindful of this. And finally, plant-based eating encompasses a spectrum of terms, from flexitarianism to veganism. For simplicity in this presentation, we will just refer to the term vegetarianism to encourage a general reduction in meat consumption, rather than advocating for strict veganism that can go very far, often changing one's practices. So obviously, the goal is not to become a vegan tomorrow, but more considering how I can progressively adopt a different approach. So one shouldn't feel guilt or pressure. This is really an exploration, not an accusation or a verdict, but something that one has to ponder. So gradual change is essential. Small shifts are meaningful, and progression is something of wisdom, something associated with wisdom. So it's better to be progressive than drastic. And once again, context matters. So one's health, one's location, one's situation, circumstances shape one's choices. So we have to be mindful of this. So finally, there are many compelling arguments supporting a plant-based diet, some of which are not rooted in Buddhism, as we said before. So for the sake of this presentation, we will refer to them, so to those arguments not related to Buddhism, as secular arguments. However, these secular arguments are closely aligned with the Buddhist perspective. It is worth noting that none of these arguments contradict Buddhism. Rather, they can be viewed as highly complementary. So it's very interesting to see how they build up together. Consequently, the arguments presented will be divided into two main categories. So first will be the secular arguments advocating for vegetarianism, and second will be the Buddhist-specific arguments. So we will look at these in detail, but at the same time quickly. And then we will conclude with some additional reflections on being a vegetarian in this world and on adopting a plant-based diet. And obviously, we will, after that, open up the floor for discussion and welcome comments and questions. So that's it for the for the introduction. I hope that this opened up the prepared the floor for something that will be hopefully useful in our personal reflection on this topic. So let's start. Let's start with the case for vegetarianism. So there are many secular arguments that can be made. For the purpose of this presentation, we will categorize these arguments into three broad categories: improving health, protecting the environment, and reducing suffering. And then as we will see, these categories will be covered through four separate sections that would be somehow building up a little bit on each other. And it is not necessarily easy to do this quickly, but this is what I'm trying to do because there's so much literature on those topics. There's so many scientists who have explored all of these questions that it could be easy to feel buried under all the evidence that is presented. So this won't be my goal here, and the goal will not be to be too technical as well. So I will obviously encourage people to probably look on their own side if they want to have precise explanations for some of the things that will be presented here. So we'll see how things go, and don't hesitate to bring some points later on in the discussion. So the first elements to consider is that a plant-based diet can foster better individual and collective health. So obviously diet is one of the most powerful levers for individual and collective well-being. And a plant-based diet is increasingly supported by mainstream medical research as protective against chronic disease. And as we will see a little bit later, the question is not just personal, it also ripples outward in our society. So I'm just using these general points here, and this is based on a recent study, a meta-analysis that looked at 55 scientific studies published between 1999 and 2023 to investigate the potential impacts of a heavy meat diet on people's health. So in that study, they highlighted the potential following consequences. So once again, it's potential consequences, so it doesn't mean that this is going to happen to a person. And also, they focus on studies that looked at heavy meat diet, so people who eat a lot of meat. So someone who eats meat once a while, as would be a flexitarian, for example, it doesn't mean that those consequences will happen. So a heavy meat-based diet can increase risks of cardiovascular disease, can also increase risk of gastrointestinal disorders, and the risk of forming various cancers. And what we see more and more is that a person who adopts a plant-based diet can lead to reducing those risks. So these are average numbers for populations that were under this study. So it is interesting to consider that the growing evidence suggesting that plant-based diet can be better for one's personal health in the long run. And as we said, it is also not just for personal health, but for collective health that we see benefits of a plant-based diet. For example, one problem that we see with farming animals for feeding humans is the rise of antibiotic resistance in our society. And this is basically normally associated to what is called antimicrobial resistance, which occurs when bacteria, viruses, fungi, and parasites do not respond to antimicrobial medicines anymore. So according to the FDA, of all antibiotics sold in the United States, approximately 80% are sold for use in animal agriculture. And of this number, about 70% are considered medically important. So when something is said medically important, it means that it's a class that is important to human medicine. So although it concerns animals, it is actually at the end important for humans or relevant for humans. So antibiotics are administered to animals in feed to marginally improve growth rates and to prevent infections. A practice that is even projected to be drastically increased worldwide in the next 15 years. And according to the CDC, there is growing evidence that antibiotic resistance in humans is promoted by the widespread use of non-therapeutic antibiotics in animals. Resistant bacteria are transmitted to humans through direct contact with animals, by exposure to animal manure, through consumption of undercooked meat, and through contact with uncooked meat or surfaces meat has touched. So that's an important issue for collectivities in general. And there is another potential collective effect for public health. It is how growing animals on farms can eventually increase risks of pandemics. So according to a recent report of the International Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, pandemics emerge from the microbial diversity found in nature. In fact, 70% of emerging diseases, for example, Ebola, Zika, Nipah, encephalitis, and almost all known pandemics, for example, influenza, HIV, AIDS, COVID-19, are considered to be zoonotic. That is, that they are caused by microbes in the animal origin that spills over to humans due to contact among wildlife and livestock. Moreover, there's an estimated 1.7 million currently undiscovered viruses that are thought to exist in mammal and avian hosts. Of these, around 600 to 800,000 could have the ability to infect humans. Therefore, the most important reservoirs of pathogens with pandemic potential are mammals, particularly bats, rodents, and primates, and some birds, in particular water birds, as well as livestock, pigs, camels, poultry, etc. So it's an important concern for us. The more we eat meat means that the more we are in contact with a large amount of animals that are farmed for the purpose of eating meat, and the more likely a new virus will emerge and a new pandemic will happen in our society. So that's the first argument about eating plant-based, having a plant-based diet can be better for personal health and for public health in general. Plant-based diet then can also be good to protect the environment. A recent meta-analysis looked at the environmental impacts of food covering 38,000 farms in 119 countries. The study showed that meat-based proteins are responsible for the vast majority of worldwide land use. It would indeed take up to 50 to 100 times as much land to produce a gram of protein from beef or lamb compared to peas or tofu. In fact, if we didn't eat meat, it would be possible to reduce agricultural land from 4 to 1 billion hectares. Therefore, changes towards less meat consumption would have large benefits for animals around the world, as wilderness could regrow to provide natural habitats for wildlife. So that's an interesting point to consider. So much of the land that is used because of the meat production. And there are also benefits adopting a plant-based diet for climate change. So reducing meat consumption could help addressing climate change. Meat production is the single most important source of methane, for example. So ruminants produce a lot of greenhouse gases. Bovine meat has been identified as the main contributor to greenhouse gas emission. This is because ruminants like cattle, goats, and sheep have several guts and produce methane through fermentation during the digestive process. So meat from non-ruminants like chickens, turkeys, and pigs is less problematic in that regard. And reducing meat consumption would reduce direct emission of greenhouse gas from burping cows, and also nitrous oxide from manure, which also contributes to global warming. And it would also even help reducing deforestation. So forest is obviously important in reducing the impact of greenhouse gas emission. So we see examples of types of meals here, and then their impact, for example, on global warming potential. If you compare a beef lasagna versus a vegan lasagna, so you see that to produce the same effect on the environment, you need 15 vegan lasagnas and to equal one beef lasagna. So these are just a couple of examples. Beef chili, you would need 28 vegan chili to equate the greenhouse consumption emitted by one beef chili, etc. So that's an interesting element to consider. So this leads us to the third argument, that a plant-based diet reduces suffering. So there is a horrifying number of land and water animals killed for human consumption. So here we see numbers that are presented. Numbers vary a lot across studies, but we can see that annually there are millions of land animals and accounting for ultimately billions of land animals, and especially billions of sea or water animals that are killed every year for the benefit of meat consumption for humans. So being a plant-based eater in itself can lead to saving a lot of lives, as we can see in numbers that are shown here. So per person, the amount of lives that can be saved by adopting a plant-based diet are quite significant once we multiply the number of plant-based eaters. Yeah, so I think it's quite an important element to consider. And it's not just the amount of animals that are killed, but also the suffering that these animals go through. So we see that our understanding of animal suffering is expanding. It's becoming more precise. We know more about pain receptors, about fear of death behavior, about mourning behavior, and so on. Animals we thought did not suffer do suffer indeed. For example, we often view fish as being animals that have short-term memories, that lack any form of notable intelligence, and don't even have the capacity to feel pain. However, this is untrue. The nervous system of fish are similar enough to those of birds and mammals to show that they do feel pain. And when fish experience something that would cause other animals physical pain, they behave in ways suggestive that they feel it. Fish will learn to avoid unpleasant experiences like electric shocks. Painkillers reduce the symptoms of pain that they would otherwise exhibit. Even crustaceans, this word is a bit hard for me to pronounce, crustaceans, such as prawns, have demonstrated similar behaviors by responding to acid being brushed on their antenna, showing complex and prolonged movement that diminished when local anesthetic was applied beforehand. Studies such as these have less I'm sorry, I got a little bit confused. So these show that small animals or fish or actually feel pain, although we cannot understand it because they display pain or experience pain in a way that is not necessarily perceptible to humans. But when scientific studies are conducted, we see that they behave in a way that that really show that they have like a stress response, even that their cortisol level become raised when they experience stress. For example, when fish are taken out of water, we can see that the cortisol level, which is the stress hormone or an indicator of stress in the body, raise when they're placed in they're taken out of the water and placed in a bucket. So these animals do suffer. And one of the arguments that is often used in the meat-eating community at large is to say, well, many animals don't feel pain, so it is okay to eat them or to use them as meat, in our food. But then we see more and more that, no, indeed, they do feel pain. It's just that we don't understand, they don't communicate their pain in a way that we can fully grasp. And the suffering does not only stop with animals. Actually, humans suffer too. So it is quite alarming to realize that this is not only animals. So it is already terrible to see that animals are suffering, but it's quite alarming to see that employees who work in animal farms and slaughterhouses also go through very difficult lives. So animal exploitation does not just make the world more violent for animals. It also makes the world more violent for us humans as well. Ed Winters remarks this again in his book. He says, like, slaughterhouses are found in lower income areas where there are fewer job opportunities. It is one of the lowest paid industrial jobs and one of the highest, and has one of the highest turnover rates. It is also in some places in the world filled with worker exploitation. And this was, for example, denounced by the Human Rights Commission in the United Kingdom. In some cases, for example, workers reported that agency managers would block off the factory exits to make them work overtime after their shifts has ended. And we also documented that slaughterhouse workers have higher prevalence of mental health issues, in particular depression and anxiety, in addition to violence supportive behaviors. They employ a variety of both adaptive and maladaptive strategies to cope with the workplace environment and its associated stressors. There's even some evidence that slaughterhouse work is associated with increased crime levels. So these people work in an environment basically where death occurs on a daily basis and where they sometimes themselves commit the killing. Sometimes it is on a chain that is automated, but sometimes they do commit the killing by themselves. And this can leave deep traces in their mind and changes basically the way they live and experience life. Okay. And then the last point is that all of this suffering can actually be in vain. And so this brings an even more dramatic twist to this suffering that we just described. So the question is, how can we justify all this suffering if a significant portion of the meat that we consume goes to waste? So a study estimated that around 12% of global meat production between slaughter and retail is wasted, which would account for about 30 million tons of meat, which would be an equivalent of 115 million cattle or 413 million pigs. It's quite impressive. And then another study suggested that around 12 billion animal lives are lost due to household food wastage per year. Yet another study estimated that globally more than 32% of all land animal die before being slaughtered. For example, while living on the farm, while in transit to the slaughterhouse, as we saw in the example given at the beginning with Ed Winter's story of conversion. So these animals were bred, which means that they would not have been born and died prematurely if humans did not manufacture them. So it's quite a tragedy to think about this, to see that all of this suffering that we discussed before, actually for many of those animals, goes to waste because they won't even be consumed in the end. So these are, I believe, powerful arguments that are addressed to convince people or argue that a plant-based diet would be preferable to a meat-based diet from a secular perspective. So we will now quickly explore the Buddhist perspective. So what Buddhism has to bring in terms of arguments for plant-based diet. So in Buddhism, there are evidence supporting plant-based diets. For example, in the long discourse of the Buddha, in long discourses of the Buddha, the Digha Nikaya, it is written that Buddhist practitioners must act in a manner that is scrupulous, compassionate, trembling for the welfare of all living beings. So it is an interesting introduction to this idea that we need to consider the welfare of all living beings in our practice. However, what is also interesting is to see that the way meat consumption is looked at from different Buddhist traditions varies. So if we take the Theravada perspective, for example, In the Theravada tradition, monks are often required to dutifully accept whatever food is given to them by the laity to avoid attachment to any particular taste. So if someone offers meat to a monk, he has to consume it. Also in the Pali Canon, for example, in the Jivaka Sutta, monks are said to be allowed to consume meat, but only if it comes from what is called the threefold purity. So the Buddha says, meat should not be eaten under three circumstances: when it is seen or heard or suspected that the being has been purposefully slaughtered for the eater. I say these are the circumstances in which meat can be eaten. So if the monk who eats the food and has not seen the food being killed, has not heard about the food being killed, and is not suspecting that the food has been killed for his purpose, then it would be considered to be okay to eat meat. The Mahayana perspective brings a different look at this question and is not as permissive as what was said in the Theravada or Shravakayana context. In fact, Mahayanists will take the Bodhisattva vow, which is a core aspect of Mahayana Buddhism. And Dudjom Rinpoche explains this in his book, The Perfect Conduct. And he says, the essence of the principal subject concerns the nature of bodhicitta, the spirit of awakening. Here, love is defined as the kind of unconditional love a mother has for her only child, directed toward all living beings by viewing them all with loving kindness, joined with the strong desire to see them established in true permanent happiness. He also adds, the desire to achieve full awakening is the wish to engage in activities solely for the purpose of benefiting others. In addition, this desire includes the intention to abandon all non-conducive circumstances that obstruct one from accomplishing the purpose of others, as well as all faults of the three doors, which is body, speech, and mind, that produces obstacles to one's accomplishment of full awakening. So we can easily derive from this view that meat eating, which involves the suffering of the animals being eaten, creates a profound contradiction with the Bodhisattva vow. And also, there are various Mahayana sutras in which the Buddha explicitly urges practitioners to abandon meat eating. For example, the entire 8th chapter of the Lankavatara Sutra is explicitly dedicated to prohibiting meat consumption. So we could read the whole thing, but obviously it would be too long. So I just took a little excerpt from this sutra, and then I wanted to read it to you to see how the Buddha has explained this in a discussion that he was having with his disciple Mahamati. So the Buddha says, if, Mahamati, meat is not eaten by anybody for any reason, there will be no destroyer of life. Mahamati, in the majority of cases, the slaughtering of innocent living beings is done for pride and very rarely for other causes. In most cases, nets and other devices are prepared in various places by people who have lost their sense of account for their appetite for the meat taste, and thereby many innocent victims are destroyed for the sake of the prize they bring in, such as birds that are moving about in the air and on land water. In that sutra, the Buddha explains that food should be consumed by noble beings of the noble family, and also what kind of food should be consumed. So just at the beginning maybe of that, there's a section that is quite interesting. So the Buddha says, the food I have permitted is gratifying to all wise people, but is avoided by the unwise. It is productive of many merits. It keeps away many evils. It has been prescribed by the ancient rishis. It comprises rice, barley, wheat, kidney beans, lentils, etc., clarified butter, oil, honey, molasses, treacle, sugarcane, coarse sugar, etc. Food prepared with these is proper food. So that's an interesting part. And the Buddha even revert the threefold purities that was discussed earlier in the Pali Canon. And he says, "It is not true, Mahamati, that meat is proper food and permissible for the Shravaka when the victim was not killed by himself, when he did not order others to kill it, when it was not especially meant for it." So it's quite obvious that the Buddha is really teaching about the importance of avoiding meat consumption. He also talks about this in the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, in the 7th chapter of the Parinirvana Sutra. And he brings it especially back to the idea of compassion. And he says, Bodhisattva Kasyapa, the whole idea is like Bodhisattva Kasyapa said to the Buddha, "O world honored one, why is it that the Tathagata does not allow us to eat meat?" And then the Tathagata answers, "O good man, one who eats meat kills the seed of great compassion." And there are more evidences, like in the Shurangama Sutra, for example. So I won't cover all of these, but it is quite clear that the Buddha is teaching about the importance of plant-based diet for Mahayana practitioners. And finally, the Vajrayana perspective has a different perspective on this. So some of you may have read the Right View written by Khenpo Tsutsim Lodro. So in this text, he explains that eating meat is also not permitted for Vajrayana practitioners, except when practicing Ganachakra Puja, which is also called Tsok. So in this context, in the Ganachakra Puja, meat is not consumed for the purpose of enjoying meat or for meat consumption per se. But in this context, everything is related to the view, to the destruction of dualistic thinking. So eating meat in this context has the purpose of helping the practitioner to broaden their mind and to deconstruct views that are not conducive to seeing the world as being pure. So Khenpo Tsutsim Lodro adds that even if one has made the vow to avoid meat eating, one should still partake in the ritual, but only by eating a tiny bit of meat, the size of a fly's leg, without developing aversion or desire for the meat being consumed. So we're playing with this dualistic thinking again. So he adds that also that technically the meat being consumed in the tsok should not come from animals that were killed and sold in the market for human consumption, as those are considered unclean. So ideally, instead, one should use the meat of animals that have died of natural causes like disease, fire, earthquake, lightning strike, and so on. So it is very interesting to see how the consumption of meat progresses through the vehicles. But ultimately, we see that there is definitely either a strong restriction on the meat that should be consumed, or a complete restriction, or a restriction in the view that is associated with how the meat should be consumed in specific rituals, and not outside of those rituals. One should also consider the impact of eating meat in terms of the consequences for oneself. So we talk about cause and effect and karma. So we can connect meat eating with various karmic effects in one's future life. And then we can look at all the different types of karmic effects that we see, for example, that we explore, for example, in our study of the words of my perfect teacher. So one could see from the fully ripened effect that meat eating and strong love for meat eating actually could lead to reincarnation as an animal. We can also see that from the perspective of the action similar to the cause, that eating meat could lead to being reborn as a carnivore who kills other beings to live. And this would perpetuate the cycle of rebirth as a carnivore for a long period of time, especially because animals don't have discernment about eating meat. They don't think morally about the act of eating meat. And we can think of it as well from the perspective of the experience similar to the cause. Because being reborn as an animal could lead one to be reborn on a farm, reborn as a farm animal who would experience sufferings of being raised and slaughtered. And this could be, again, perpetuated for many lifetimes in the future. But the karmic effects might not only affect one, it might eventually affect more people. The connected discourses of the Buddha, the Samyutta Nikaya, in that text, the Buddha presents the case against meat eating with the context of the broader rejection of violence. And then the Buddha will talk about the fact that it causes suffering to both the victim and the perpetrator. And we know, for example, in our study of the words of my perfect teacher, that karma is not always or only individual, and it is shared and often not even divided. So if I am in a restaurant and I order meat from that restaurant, I might not have killed the animal, but the butcher who killed the animal, the owner of the restaurant who put this animal on the menu, the waiter who is serving the animal to me in my plate, and myself enjoying the meat will participate in the whole creation of the karmic effects that were existing at the moment where the animal was being raised and farmed and slaughtered. And finally, we should also use this wonderful contemplation that we see as Mahayanists, especially of thinking of all sentient beings as our parents. So all sentient beings have at some point in beginningless time been our mother, caring for us with complete devotion. So to eat the flesh of any being, in a way, is to eat the flesh of someone who in a past life has cared for us deeply. So this should be seen not as guilt, but as view of openness and connection with all beings, and considering that whatever sentient beings that surrounds me was in a past life certainly my mother, or perhaps my father, or perhaps my friend, or perhaps my brother or my sister. So we can bring this contemplation as well about eating meat. And then just to quickly look at some final elements. It is not necessarily easy to do this, to make the switch, to decide to become a vegetarian. But it is important to contemplate on all the points that we have mentioned before. And to, having all this in mind, develop compassion for oneself and compassion for others. So choosing not to eat meat can be considered a deeply compassionate act for me and for others. But then I need to consider how to properly nourish my body when I do this. So we see that a plant-based diet can be fully sufficient, except that there might be a few considerations to consider. But this is definitely a possibility for a person who is overall healthy. And the goal is to combine this habit or this change of habit with our personal practice to bring more meaning to our life, to bring more appreciation to all beings around us, one plate at a time, basically. So we know that it is important to watch our diet as vegetarians. So here are just a few examples of elements that should be included in one's diet. So for proteins, one should eat legumes, tofu, tempeh, seitan, quinoa nuts, which will provide a variety of amino acids that we need. For iron, we should consume lentils, spinach, pumpkin seeds, paired with vitamin C to boost absorption. So it is recommended, I'm sorry, it is recommended to use vitamin supplements. And there are significant vegetarian-friendly options for vitamin supplements as well. So I recommend people to do this, and maybe even people who eat meat should be potentially complement their diet with supplement, because studies show that meat eaters also have under consumption or there's an under prevalence of some vitamins and nutrients even for meat eaters. So it's not just because you're a vegetarian that you will have issues. Meat eaters also have issues. So calcium, we can take it from fortified plant milks, tofu, bok choy, almonds, and sesame seeds. Vitamin D as well should also be consumed as supplement, because it is often hard for people who live in northern climates, for example, to have enough vitamin D. Omega-3 can be consumed, gained through flaxseed, chia, walnuts, hemp. Vitamin B12 is probably the hardest element, and then definitely a supplement. Vitamin supplement will be a good thing for vegetarians in general. And finally, a variety of whole food is important, like when eating bread or pasta, for example, it is, or even rice. It is better to take whole food in general. So maybe as a last point, being a vegetarian in a non-vegetarian world can be challenging, and it might not be easy for one to change one's diet habits. It can be complicated to be a vegetarian when one is surrounded by meat-eating people. One may face criticism and social judgment. Family members, friends, and peers may not understand this choice. But, and especially for this reason, it is important for one to choose to change their habit and be resolute, have conviction about this. Otherwise, it will be easy to be defeated when you're surrounded with people who do not share this view. But it is important to be reasonable and to consider one's personal situation. So not to be too drastic, not to be too strict, not to be too rigid, depending on how things evolve in one's environment. And then once again, Khenpo Tsultrim Lodro has many interesting things to say about this in his book, The Right View. So he says, it would be best if one can be vegetarian for life. If it is too difficult to do it now, try for as long as you can, say 1, 2, 3 years or longer. If that is also not possible, one can set aside certain time to be vegetarian, such as during the following 4 months of the Tibetan calendar. So in January, which is considered a very auspicious time of year, in April, for example, when Buddha, which is the birthday of Buddha Shakyamuni and Sagadawa, in June, which is the time when the Buddha started turning the wheel of the Dharma, or in September, when the Buddha returned from the land of the 33 heavens after teaching his mother and other gods there. If it is still not doable, just make the 10th, 15th, 29th, and 30th of each month the day to be vegetarian. And then Khenpo Tsultrim Lodro further adds, no matter how one chooses to do, the most important is to pledge as follows. Due to various reasons, I'm not able to remain vegetarian for long, but I will hold firmly my promise to be vegetarian in these 4 days or 4 months. May the merits of this promise help me refrain from eating meat and all my future lives. So the idea is that we need to contemplate on this, and we don't have to change everything today. Think of removing meals with meat progressively. It is a moment to be aware, and we can pause before eating and acknowledge what is arriving at the table. So food consumption is a moment of contemplation, is a moment of meditation. It is a moment maybe to reflect on the animal that is being served on the plate and reflect on their suffering. Or it is a moment to appreciate perhaps the fact that we are having a meal that does not include meat, and think of the merit that this can bring to ourselves, and dedicate this merit to all sentient beings, and especially to animals being slaughtered. Yeah. So it is a question that we need to ask ourselves. And we have to remember that it is a progression. So the path of compassion is walked one step and one meal at a time. Okay, that's it. Thank you. So I don't know if there are any questions or reactions about this. Opening the floor to discussions and reflections. I hope that this whole presentation made sense. As I said, there were many topics to cover, and I tried to cover them in as simply as I could. So I don't know if there are. Yes, Ifisha or Nim.
Yes. Are there any recommendations to help offset people who have to have a non-vegetarian diet due to health reasons? Any practices or anything that they can do to help mitigate the karma that they would experience from such?
Yeah, definitely. I think definitely one should practice purification. And definitely one should, said here, bring awareness to consumption and to state the fact that one has to consume meat, although maybe one would prefer not to. And this can be a moment to generate compassion for sentient beings. And perhaps even a moment to consider that one could see this situation as a possibility to create a connection with beings in future lives, and hope that one could be perhaps a positive influence in that connection that was created in future life. But obviously, if one is forced to consume meat, even if they don't want to and they would prefer not to, this is not an easy situation. So trying to, as much as possible, I guess, communicate as well with doctors and nutritionists to see to what extent meat can be reduced, or to what extent meat consumption can be minimized, so that one still preserves their health while not creating as much effect in the life of other sentient beings as much as possible. So the idea is to try to minimize as much as we can. And we've seen in stories of the Buddha, for example, that there are moments where one can, because he's forced to do something, one can restrict to those moments, and then the rest of the time can avoid those practices. And maybe this will help mitigate the overall karmic effects that one will have to suffer due to this. So that would be perhaps something that would come to mind. But I guess as well, we need compassion to ourselves too, because if it's something that I cannot do, I'm forced to do, also I shouldn't be living in constant guilt, because this is definitely not helping one. So it's important to be compassionate towards others, but also compassionate toward oneself. Thank you for the question. Yes, Sally?
Thank you very much for the presentation. Actually, my heart feels very heavy when you're thinking all this number and so forth. And we just seems a doomsday because we learn from Buddha Shakyamuni's story that his clan all destroyed because they, ate fish before. Anyway, let's not talk about comments here. I mean, we all well known. But one thing struck me that, we have, as you listed, many points that we are not, meat is not good for us. But I think we could, if all fails, I think we could look at our own body, our physical makeup, compared to the line. Are we meant to be eat meaters? Okay, I think very easily our teeth and jaw are different. Like lion carnivores, they have very sharp teeth that can slice through the meat and bones. And they just move very up, open, very wide, just to chew food. They can swallow meat in large chunks. But our human, we have, we don't have very sharp teeth. We have maybe, a little bit, but it's most of teeth are for grinding molar, designed for crushing and plant matters and seed and so forth. And our jaw is moved side to side. We cannot open our mouth very big, right? And they also consider our hands. The lines have very sharp retractable claws, right? They can go hunting, grasping, and so forth. And our what do we have? We have flat nails and develop thumbs and so forth. So our hands are structurally optimized to getting fruit, digging and manipulate tool and so forth. So our hands are different. And also our mouth, saliva, like lions and carnivores, their saliva doesn't have contain digestive enzyme just to lubricate the meat ore. And our human, we have amulets, and they just breaking down complex carbohydrate and starches and so forth while we are chewing. So our human saliva is closer to natural or more alkaline, typical plant-eating animals. And also our stomach. The lions, they have very highly acidic stomach environment, like pH 1 or 2, to kill pathogens in the meat and rapidly dissolve bones, cartilage, and the tough animal proteins. But our human stomach is moderately acidic. It's a pH around 2 and so forth. Although we can cook fresh processed meat, but it's not as potent as the carnivores. Another thing is that the intestinal length. Animals do have very short length compared to their body. In our human stomach, intestine, if you look at our digestive tract, it's very about 6 times our body length. So this is meant to pipeline to give the body enough time to ferment, absorb the nutrient, fibers, and complex sugar, and so forth. So I think another thing they listed is liver detoxification. The lions metabolize everything, go out so uric acid and so forth. The human have very limited capacity to detoxify uric acid, and we don't have this uricase enzyme. So if you consume excessive high meat diet can lead to health issues like a gout or kidney stone and so forth. So it's just how our body built, and looks like we are not carnivores. Maybe we could be mix the diet with a little amount of meat. It's called what? Omnivores, yeah.
Omnivore or flexitarian. Sometimes we use flexitarian as well. Yeah.
So therefore, this, how our body is built, we are not meant to be a big meat eaters. Okay, so that's one thing. Another thing is I mentioned that if we must meat eat, for whatever reason, I think there's a good news here. The scientists are growing meat from petri dishes. I think some of the salmon has been used in the sushi restaurant in California already. So with this, all these sources from animals, but they are grown in petri dishes, not involved in killing. So maybe this aspect can be more highly developed. People can eat the meat from petri dish, very similar to come directly from killing animals. That's one good news. Let's hope this will become more prevalent in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Sally. These are great points as well, indeed. I did not go in this direction in the presentation, but I'm very happy that you bring them up, because indeed they're very important points. And actually comparing humans or human body with animals is interesting. And also we see from different studies that eating meat might have contributed to the development of the human brain as well, and then might have led to transformations that led to the modern men, or men and women, or men as a general category that we know now. But that being said, this, for example, this old argument does not necessarily work in today's society when we have so many options, so much access to alternative in terms of getting all the vitamins, nutrients, amino acids that maybe meat might have contributed in the past. So I think this is a good point. And the meat created in lab, like petri meat as well, is another great example where eventually it might be possible to create meat without implying necessarily the suffering of animals. But then we still would have to consider what will be the impacts on one's health of consuming this meat, because as we've discussed before, high consumption of meat can lead to consequences on one's health. So all of these elements will have to be factored in. Yeah, but thank you so much. Yes, Christina.
Hey, I think, yeah, Sally shared a very important point, but I just want to share something recently. I did some, for some reason, I did some study in herb medicine and acupuncture. So I think if we sit back one step to look at our body, how to make us healthy, actually, you'll find like meat or eating meat or not eating meat actually is not the big contribution. So if according to the Yellow Canon, which is the herb medicine's Bible, so it said the big impact, two things. One is emotion. If you calm down your mind, basically every emotion from your mind will impact your organ. So if your mind is not calm, you always get angry, worry. Those emotions eventually will come to your organ to make you sick. If you are not, if keeping doing that, actually, like you feel angry, it will impact your liver. If your liver is not good, it's continuously impact your heart, your other organs, and then you become unhealthier, unhealthier, unhealthier. This is one thing I learned. Another thing is actually in the word of my perfect teacher, Campo also mentioned the balance is very important. What we eat, let's say we eat plant or we eat meat, but we need to have capability to observe those good things from a plant, good things, let's say something from meat, whatever, right? So if our body's organs working is not balanced, so whatever we eat, it's not able to digest, it's not able to become the blood and energy to support our body, so we're not healthy. So that's why the very important point is keep our body healthy. How much from the how much factor from what we eat? That's a good question. Probably not much, probably like 1/3 or less than 1/3. But we spend so much effort to looking for what we eat and to avoid very important point, let's say, to calm down our mind or adjust our organ system to be able to do whatever we want them to do, to get rid of, like improve our immune system, to let the outside, the let's say the cold weather, the hot weather, whatever, like the COVID, not impact us, to improve our immune system. So I think that's something we can think about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Ifisha?
Yeah, Jonathan,
Oh,
it's
Nim.
Nim
Okay.
here.
Yes. Hi.
Jonathan, yeah, your story about Ed Winter's story
Yeah.
reminded me of another story that I've heard in some of the teachings, Buddhist teachings, where there was a lady who was in hospice care. I think she was getting close to her death. And she told one of the, I think, hospice nurses this story where she was getting close to her death and she was contemplating on her life. And what came to her mind is the number of chickens that she believes that she consumed in her life. So about, 1 or 2 chickens per week for all her life. And she was looking and contemplating, and she was just thinking like there was something like 4,000, 5,000 chickens that she would have consumed in her life. And it was interesting that as she was getting close to her death, this is something that came to her, similar to what Ed was talking about with the accident. It's interesting that as she was getting close to her death, this is the kind of thing that could come up. This is very interesting, yeah.
Yeah, indeed, very interesting. So one is contemplating their own death and then generating broader view on death in general, and on death
Yeah,
of other beings as well. Yeah, this
yeah,
is actually probably a very good thing to do. If we are on our deathbed, if we're able to contemplate this, and this can probably help us generate a better condition for our own death and the journey that follows. So it's indeed quite nice.
yeah.
I'm conducting a study with a doctoral student right now, and then we're looking at how looking at certain media, like a TV show, can eventually generate feelings for the environment and for, generally speaking, pro-social and pro-environmental behavior. And in that study, people are asked to watch the series called Alone. So Alone is a very interesting series where maybe about a dozen of people who all have high survivalist skills are sent in the wild in different places of a large location, so they cannot talk to each other. And what they have to do is survive there as long as they can, and without knowing what other people are doing and without knowing who is abandoning. So it's very special, very contemplative. People talk to themselves, and people face their own their own mind, and then through solitude, and then they experience a lot of challenges. And one of the participants was watching the series, and then in one specific episode, there's a person, they have to hunt because they don't have, no one provides food, so they have to hunt, they have to fish. And then in one episode, there's a person who hunted down and killed an animal. And then that person came to the animal and paid respect to the animal and said how much she appreciates the life that she's giving to her, and how much she was sorry for taking the life of the animal. And suddenly that participant started thinking about very, very strongly about the whole, basically the whole conversation that we were having today, and about the fact that there is so much suffering, and then that the animals that come to one's plate is, we don't know where it comes from, and then we don't understand the suffering. And then this even brought back to her attention the fact that she used to be a vegetarian before, and that she abandoned that diet. And now it will be very interesting to see, because she's writing a diary, and this was week 3 of the study. So we'll see how her own contemplation of mortality of the animal that she saw on TV will eventually spill over to her life, and maybe this will lead to her adopting or desiring to adopt a vegetarian diet again. So in a way, I feel that it is a bit connected to what you're saying. That person is obviously not at her deathbed, but she is contemplating a lot of aspects of her life through witnessing mortality, to witnessing the death of an animal. So I thought that this was quite interesting. So indeed, those moments are great moments of awareness, of mindfulness, and contemplation of life, and contemplation of impermanence, and contemplation of precious aspects of our life, which is other topics that we could have covered, but eventually I guess it would have been too long if I tried to include all of these. So thank you so much, Nim.
Okay.
So I guess there were no questions or comments on YouTube, right?
No.
No.
Yeah, but still, okay, still people is watching. So if we if you decide to end, I will end the stream. Okay.
Yeah. Maybe I will just do a quick dedication, as we often do in our practice. So we try to start well by preparing our body, our mind, generating an attitude positive to ourselves and others, and then we did this exploration together, and then we're going to try to end this all well by dedicating the merit that we might have accumulated through this contemplation, this reflection and discussion. So by this accumulation of merit, may I obtain all-seeing omniscience, and may all faults be defeated. The whirling, turbulent waves of birth, aging, sickness, and death. From this ocean of samsara, may I liberate beings. Okay, thank you. So we can stop the sharing.
I ended the live stream.